thank you to everybody for joining us on our Fair Observer first ever live event. We're calling it FO Live. The title may evolve as time goes on, but that's certainly our working title. We have Atul Singh, who is the founder and editor of Fair Observer. We also have with us Carle, who's the former US Deputy National Intelligence Officer. And our third panelist is Esther. She's a research assistant at the Education University of Hong Kong and is currently teaching and researching China and the international relations of the Asia-Pacific region. Let's kick off perhaps, if we can, with a question for Carle, because I just want to define really that term Cold War before we start talking about whether there is a Cold War between China and the US. What does Cold War actually mean?
Yeah, well, it's an important question and not one with a necessarily certain or clearly defined, universally accepted answer. We all take it to mean our thumbnail understanding to be a clash between the great powers, and particularly between the two great powers. The US and the USSR for 50 years after World War II were exponentially more powerful than any other nation, and so we think that it's the clash between the two great powers. The Cold War that we lived had a defining existential ideological component. It was a zero-sum game, and one of the two powers, at least, although many would argue both, were quite expansionist ideologically, and were attempting, or at least were perceived to be attempting, to change the nature of all other regimes. The US and China don't really fit that definition. For arch conservatives in the United States and perhaps elsewhere, China is a revolutionary expansionist power. But it's pretty clear that academics on US campuses tend to be more communist, actually, sincerely, than the Chinese Communist Party itself. They are a totalitarian organization, and they are proud and nationalistic, but they are not really communists except largely in name at this point. So the rivalry between the US and China is not really an existential one necessarily. It is a clash for power, for preeminence, spheres of influence, and so on. And both the right in the United States and it appears the Chinese communists under Xi last several years. But that's the big question: is it or is it not?
Okay, can I take that to Esther, perhaps? Obviously, Glenn mentioned it's perhaps less ideological, more based around issues of power. So just explain, what are the reasons, what are the background reasons for this US-China rivalry?
I think the main background reason for this rivalry is the both leaders' policies. For instance, in Xi Jinping's policy, he is trying to allocate a more ambitious foreign policy. He is quite different from his two previous leaders' objectives to buy time and to keep a low profile. Because in his two past leaders, they would like to participate in international organizations like the entry to the WTO in 2001, and there is not much attempt to challenge the US power. But however, when Xi Jinping rose to power, he promoted China's dream, the rejuvenation of a great nation, to make China become stronger, and even wants China to be a global superpower by the end of 2049. And he also promoted a concept called Asian security concepts. And this aims for people to Asia to run the affairs of the region rather than really determined by other external powers like the US. So that's why in the US eyes, what China did is to try to displace the US-led order by offering other economic or security incentives to neighboring countries. And this is what China is doing right now, like the establishment of the One Belt, One Road strategy and also the AIB, the new bank. These are the new platforms for China to control the new regional or even global environment. So that's why US is feeling more and more insecure regarding the China's rise. And US is fearful of China's replacement to the regional order. And so that's why when Trump rose to power, especially part of the reason for him to get elected in 2016 is to highlight the trade deficit with China, blaming China as the currency manipulator and undergoing unfair trade practices, and to promote America first. So that's why Trump would like to narrow down, like to enlarge its gap between US and China, and to start the trade war by imposing tariff more than 34 billion worth to Chinese industries or its China's goods.
Okay. Atul, can I bring you in? And obviously, one thing that Esther mentioned then was the Belt and Road Initiative, which I know you've written about for Fair Observer. Why is that a threat to the West? And just as another question, if you can perhaps answer two questions in one, why has all this worsened since COVID-19? How does that play into all this?
All right, very, very quickly. To understand the Belt and Road Initiative, you have to go deeper into looking at China's economic rise. And if you do so, one of the things that is absolutely striking is that the GDP, exports as a percentage of GDP, as per data from the World Bank, went up from 4.5% of the GDP in 1978 to 36% in 1996. Now, since the glory days of 2006, Chinese exports have fallen. But the important thing is that China's growth has been spectacular. China has become an export-oriented economy. China is the biggest exporter in the world. China is the workshop of the world, and it has excess capacity. It has tremendous excess capacity, quite a bit like the US in 1945. The US had a lot of excess capacity as well at that time because it had ramped up industrial production to basically serve the Allies. And so for China, it's very important to have external markets. And there's one view which looks at the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, as China, the vision of China as a supremely confident power with a vision and energy to become the preeminent global power, as it was for most of its history. Another view, however, is to look at the BRI as a reaction to its three big fears. Now, what are three big fears of China? Well, of course, number one is running out of energy. The Straits of Malacca can be rammed any moment. There is a US fleet in the South China Sea. At its narrowest, it's 2 miles wide. Glenn has been there and Glenn has seen it, and Glenn can expand more on it. So all you need to cut off the Straits of Malacca, and a former Chinese president has acknowledged it in speeches, is just close it off. The Australian Navy could do it, the Japanese Navy could do it, the US Navy obviously could do it, hell, even the Indian Navy could do it. What happens to China then? So that is one fear. So they are trying to create this web to make sure that they have energy. The second is, of course, Xinjiang. So remember this, the BRI was a product of a speech Xi Jinping gave on 8 September 2013. That's when it was launched in Nazarbayev University. And he alluded to great proverbs from the past. He's a student of history, although he trained as an engineer at Tsinghua. And that is basically trying to envelope the entire Central Asian republics, which are Islamic, into an economic region. And if there's prosperity, then Xinjiang moves up and the Uyghur problem is solved. And of course, there's a carrot and stick involved. You throw them into re-education camps on the one hand, and on the other hand, try and boost the economy. At the same time, you get energy, you get gas, you get, there's the Kashgan oil field. So there is the Xinjiang factor. And of course, the third is this real fear that the US and Europe might cut it off at the knees. The Middle Kingdom has excess capacity. It has been guilty of dumping, of course, and it needs its markets to export, just as in the 19th century, the Europeans needed colonies to export. I mean, the British needed to send clothes to us in India. So nothing new there. And so it is creating its own version of the Marshall Plan, an Afro-Eurasian economic and trading rival to the US-dominated transatlantic one. So it hopes that this will create new markets for its goods, and it would be able to supply cement, steel, and other goods, as well as find useful activity for its high-speed rail firms, for its railway firms, for its road construction companies. And all of that is going on all across Africa. I've been all across Africa. I was in Senegal, and Musée du Civilisation Noire is being built by the Chinese. So the West is, in a way, right to fear, but the West forgets that most of these investments are white elephants, and
right.
China doesn't have three things, and I'll end with that. And the three things it doesn't have is technological supremacy, cultural hegemony, and political allies. So Chinese cannot mount a challenge to the West, not yet anyway.
So Glenn, if I can just go back to you a moment. The way China is acting towards its neighbors in the South China Sea, is that the main concern for the US, or are there other issues that are frankly more important in terms of the theft of IP, national security? Gosh, well, you go through, what are the issues that actually do concern the US?
Well, they all have a common thread, and cynics will say the US is, of course, a duplicitous power and talks about ideals and in fact, imposes its own will for its own national interest. And all of that is true and somewhat unfair simultaneously. What drives the United States is what drives any state, and that is its national interest. The US is different, however, from any other power, any other global power in history, really, I would argue. Now, critics will take a different view, and I understand. We'll get to that later, which is that if the United States leaders perceive its national interest existentially in play, it will then attempt to impose its will. That is certainly true. However, since 1945, for the first time in history, the predominant global power, the United States, has created a normative international system that, on the whole, even the great power itself abides by. It does accept defeat even on issues at the World Trade Organization or in the United Nations, multilaterally, in other trade areas and so on, that it views as non-existential. And this has accrued to literally the global benefit of almost every state on Earth. That is the difference. So first, the United States defends its national interests when it is an existential perception. Absolutely. That could be in the South China Sea for freedom of navigation. It could be with regard to intellectual property, if that would affect who is the predominant power in a given sector and globally. And the United States views as existential defending this normative international system, which of course the Chinese and others will say, well, this is a neo-imperialist vestige that lets the winners of World War II shape things unfairly. That seems not to actually have been the case, and even the Chinese didn't did not subscribe to that view really until Xi came into power.
I'll segue to Esther there. Obviously, again, Glenn mentioned Xi. So I want to know from your perspective over there in Hong Kong, how important is the personality of Xi, not just Trump, but Xi, in terms of creating this perhaps, if not new Cold War, then certainly increased tension?
Well, I think China actually doesn't want to appear weak to its citizens, but I think Xi Jinping is not acting rashly to keep face, but with its own consideration and strategic reasons, both internally and externally. Like, for instance, China is not used to high economic growth to justify the one-party rule, because according to China's belief, when people are getting richer, the demands for democracy will fall. So economy acts as a means for China's reduced survival. But due to the rise of the COVID-19, there is an expectation that there will be a contraction in China's economy, and it's really hard to achieve its domestic goal of moderately prosperous society by the end of 2021. So that's why internally China opts to feel nationalism to divert citizens' attention from such poor economic performances. For instance, China talked about White House chaotic management of the pandemic that caused thousands of casualties, and it is still in rising. So as to praise Chinese way and its own actions, that Chinese way is way more efficient than dealing with the virus, and also to prove to the citizens that strong leadership is necessary in times of this crisis. And this could help strengthen Xi Jinping and his government's power. And externally, China is also not acting rashly to keep face, but to move strategically to reorient its focus away from foreign countries' questions over China during the pandemic, especially when China is getting so late for closing its borders. And for China is using some sort of diplomatic campaign, like the mask diplomacy, to share medical equipment to countries who are in need, to gain support from those countries. And moreover, China also knows that other countries are similarly still affected or too occupied by the virus. And the situation is not to be under control. Okay. So those countries are perceived to be more weaker and unable to push back China's aggression. So that's why China is showing strength to defend its territorial claims, like deploying more military to the South China Sea, jet to the Taiwan Strait, and even being in presence in China-India border clashes.
Okay, thanks, Esther. We've just had a question actually about COVID-19. So Atul, I did sort of half ask you, but I'm going to ask you again. This is a question from Rishi Arora. He asked, do you think after COVID-19, China will still be able to become one of the world's leading powers, if not the leading power, by 2049?
So China is going to be one of the world's leading powers in our lifetime and beyond. It's not going to go back to the 19th century days when the Qing Empire was tottering. The question is whether it can be the leading power, and the answer is absolutely not. And the answer is simply given by people who vote with their feet. How many of us want to go and live in China? The answer is very few. How many of the Chinese, given a chance, would like to come to the US or the UK or Europe? The answer is quite a few. And so China is unable to retain its most talented people, the same as much of the third world. So China is a curious power. On the one hand, it seems very mighty. It has a big military. It has impressive achievements, the biggest and fastest industrialization in history. But I also think China is a brittle power. China lacks, as I said, the technological supremacy of the West. For instance, smart manufacturing that is coming all across the US and in Europe. China doesn't have an edge there. Cultural hegemony. No one watches Chinese movies outside China. The Wolf Warrior movies are a big hit back home. No one really cares for them, but everyone watches Iron Man. And everyone wants to go to Harvard, you know, the place where Glenn came out from. So you can always, as an ex-CIA man, he can tell you that you can always wave a green card for the children of third world bureaucrats and diplomats and get them.
I would never do that.
Oh, yes, of course you wouldn't. We absolutely trust you on that. And you can get them to sing to the American hymn sheet. So China, what can it wave? We'll give you a green card. Who wants to go there? So the cultural hegemony, which is through language, which is through common law, which is through educational institutions, which is through norms, which is through exactly the global multilateral system that America created after 1945, is something China does not have. And following on from that, the third point is it doesn't have political allies. Most of the Southeast Asian nations are willing to side with an America headed by Donald Trump, because hopefully, even though there has been talk of postponing elections, in America there is an expiry date to a leader. And I think, as long as America doesn't dissolve into internal tensions, as long as Europe doesn't totally fragment, the danger to the West is not China, but internal division. And that's the danger for China too. In fact, a lot of this aggression, this external aggression, is to unify people internally. Because the Chinese have a problem in Xinjiang. Even a child knows that. The Chinese have a problem in Tibet. Everyone knows that. The Chinese have a problem in Hong Kong. The Chinese cannot get the Taiwanese to join China. It'll be over their dead bodies. So China, as an empire, has always suffered revolt, has always lived with the fear of dissolution. And remember, a lot of these territories, Xinjiang and Tibet, were conquered by the Qing. In fact, it's exactly 300 years since the Qing troops marched into Lhasa. So the fear of fragmentation is pretty high. Will China be the world's leading power? Rishi and everyone else? Absolutely not. Pas possible. Will it be a great power? For sure, in our lifetime and beyond.
Okay, thank you, Atul. One question also, perhaps following on from that, I think this one's for Glenn, is that it's from Atishay Jain. He asks, if the US wants to maintain its status as the global power, why is it reducing its role internationally and giving more opportunities for China to replace it? Examples would be leaving the TPP, the WHO, etc. And is that because of Trump, or is that something that's perhaps a long-term trend?
Yeah, well, I learned in school that good writing is to be direct. So I'll say the reason is because we have an incompetent fascist in the Oval Office, who is an aberration, one hopes, but who does represent an abiding, strong, and yet minority current in American culture and politics. There, in 1941, as World War II was underway already, the Americans filled Madison Square Garden, 19,000 people, who were all American Nazis. And they did this to Adolf Hitler, only a few months before the beginning of World War II. There's a strong isolationist strain in American politics. So Trump is not, in some ways, an aberration. The aberration is that this strain has, now for the first time in 70 years, come to dominate and hold the levers of power. People like myself, in some ways, I am a dinosaur because I'm from the Northeast. I'm from the establishment, European-centric establishment elite. We are viewed with suspicion progressively. This is a 75-year trend by the heartland, and our policies, which are internationalist, have been discredited in these isolationist circles. Nonetheless, I think fundamentally the views that have shaped my life culturally and professionally remain the dominant ones. All the polls on almost all issues, so 2/3 of the American public wants to remain engaged in all of the institutions that the questioner cited. So one hopes that it is an aberration, but as Atul said, Rome fell not because of the barbarians, and China, frankly, fell multiple times, not because of the barbarians, but because of internal contradictions. And that is the issue now that we need to resolve in the US.
Okay, there might be another one, unfortunately, for Glenn as well, but maybe we'll come back to you, Glenn, in just a moment. We'll just go to Esther just for a slightly different perspective again. Hong Kong was mentioned, India was briefly mentioned. Just give us an idea of how these places play a role in that conflict or that tension between the US and China. For instance, is Hong Kong even just a pawn in this kind of race for power?
Yes, I do think Hong Kong is a pawn in this Sino-US rivalry because there are some clashes of values between the two global superpowers. For China, it emphasizes so much on authoritarian control and the limitation of civil liberties. While for the US, it supports democracy and freedom. And it can be shown in Hong Kong issues because China focuses so much on the one country part, and then viewing Hong Kong as a part of China after the handover, while the US concerns much on the rights of Hong Kong people granted by the two systems, such as the rule of law, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of assembly. And it can be seen, the clashes can be seen in the recent Beijing's national security law to Hong Kong. And according to the law, it bans acts of secession, subversion, and foreign interference to endanger national security. And China can have the power how the law to be interpreted. And they already set up a national security commission to enforce the laws. And regarding China's perspectives, Xi Jinping wants to enhance his hardline power to restore Hong Kong's social order and wants Hong Kong to be more politically loyal to the Chinese government. And more importantly, China is also worried about the spillover effects of Hong Kong protests to other parts of the mainland Chinese cities. And that could threaten China's regional security if all provinces, people are going out to protest for more freedom.
I was just reading an interesting question here about UFOs. I don't know if you've seen it on the chat channel here. I'm just going to put that. They specifically asked for Glenn's response, but so we'll go to Glenn briefly, and then maybe we'll go to Atul for a few closing remarks. But this is from Russell. He's asked, perhaps this is related. Does anyone consider the emerging issue of the US's confirmation of the existence of UFOs and their paradigm-shifting technological capabilities to be related to a new Cold War between the US and China? I don't know if this is something you're aware of, Glenn. Perhaps these classified technologies are the focus of a new classified arms race. Have you any thoughts on that, Glenn?
If I understood, you did say UFO as an unidentified flying objects. But yes, well, one hopes that we have all sorts of technologies we don't know about yet. I do know, this is 2020, so almost literally 40 years ago. I am getting old. Something I can talk about. I was shown something by some of our CIA scientists that was already so obsolete then that it was in a museum and they could show a layman intelligence officer like me, not one of the science and technology people. And he showed me a dragonfly. And I thought, well, you know, that's nice. And he said, no, it's not a dragonfly. This is actually a drone listening device, which we fly up onto windowsills and then we listen to conversations with. And that was 40 years ago. And it was then already considered, you know, hopelessly out of date. So what the American Air Force pilots see, I don't know, but they are not delusional. One would, without being a crazy person, imagine that there are shocking technologies, you know, behind the screen, behind
the scenes. Yeah.
But you know, the U.S. is not the only one with brilliant scientists working on fancy stuff. You know, so are the Chinese, and fears for Huawei and 5G are not unfounded. You know, only a fool would trust a rival.
Interesting thoughts. Atul, we have just 5 minutes or so left, so I just want to go perhaps to our last question, which has been emailed in by Adam Irvine, and he asks, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US was symbolized by the space race. What now is your prediction for the symbolic clash, if you like, between these two powers? Can you predict what that clash could look like?
I think one of the things that is certainly going to happen when historians look back at this period, they will look at 1945 to say 2016 perhaps as one period, or 2020 as one period, and thereafter as another period, because the fundamental shift that has happened throughout the world has been a weakening of existing norms. Those happen to be international norms. Those happen to be domestic norms. Those happen to be democracies. Those happen to be social structures. And COVID-19 has now ripped up the social order as we know it, destroyed the global economy as we know it. Globalization had its winners and losers. And within the US, and I've driven across the US 4 times, I've been to Michigan, I've been to rundown towns in the South, I've been to Bakersville when I was driving west, and you can see how America starts getting very rundown very quickly. Actually, from Palo Alto to East Palo Alto is a different universe. And the winners of globalization in America never compensated the losers. Workers did lose their jobs. Ross Perot was right in 1992. Jobs would go, the unskilled jobs did go. That's the nature of trade. That's the nature of the global economy, labor arbitrage. And what has happened is that we are now living in an age of fear, anger, hate, and terror. What do I mean by that? There is real fear within countries. In the US, the left fears the right will asphyxiate it. The right fears the left is going to choke it with political correctness. And those of us who are fair-minded and reasonable are a bit like Montesquieu, as Peter once pointed out. We will get shot at from both sides. The same is true in many places else. And because you have this huge sense of intolerance, it's us versus them. It is strong men taking their place again. And democracies in all institutions, a trophy over time. Plato's Athenian democracy had a trophy by the time Plato was writing, lest we forget. The Republic is a very good indicator of what happens when democracy weakens, when civic conscience weakens, when civic solidarity goes away. And that solidarity has weakened around the world. And so you have strongmen. You have Erdogan in Turkey. You've got Trump here. You've got Orban in Hungary. I could go on till tomorrow. But the point is, there's a zeitgeist. That zeitgeist has strong men promising simple solutions to complex problems. Because elites failed. I mean, I gave a talk in Google in 2016 on the global rise of the far right, and then talked about, the failure of elites, the rise in inequality and the loss of identity. There's also a time of massive urbanization, so people don't know who they are. And amidst all of this turmoil and tension, which has been exacerbated by COVID-19, you have a real chance of a crumbling of a particular order. And I do believe that the old order from 1945 to 2016 is dead. Humpty Dumpty have fallen off the wall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put Humpty Dumpty back again. A new order will come. That new order will have to, change, and historians will look back as that is the defining feature of this time.
Atul, Esther, Glenn, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much to you, and also to all our questioners, particularly the one about the UFO, for joining us today. We've got all your details, so we can always be in touch and continue the conversation. Hopefully we can lead to perhaps a new article for Fair Observer about collating all these thoughts together. So thank you to everyone, and thank you for your patience, particularly at the start. Thank you.